Chapter 2, Britain and its Colonies. This is part 1 of Chapter 2, Britain and its Colonies. This will go through the first half of the chapter through Virginia. English background. The British Isles. British Isles are off the coast of mainland Europe. You can see they contain basically 4 different countries. You have Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and of course England. Northern Ireland will come around later after you have struggles between the English and the Irish. In 1603, you have the union of Scotland and England. And this is where you start to see the first Union Jack, if you will. The Union Jack would be the combination of the Scottish flag, the English flag, and the Welsh flag, or Northern Ireland flag also. But the Cross of St. George laid over the Cross of St. Andrew is what the Union Jack is. Now, the interesting thing here, and what sets them apart from most of Europe, is their isolation. You can see they have the English Channel right here and the North Sea, which kind of keeps them from most of Europe's problems and kept them relatively safe. You know, the major invasion would have been the Norman invasion way back in 1100 or 1200, whatever it was. Also, another thing that was unique about them was the fact that their king had limited power. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more in class because it wasn't kind of always that way. It kind of grew out of a series of events, which we'll also talk about in this chapter. But it had Parliament, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, which helped limit the power of the king. And, as it says right here, English liberties, it developed a very strange mishmash of laws and codes that helped ensure that Englishmen had unalienable rights. It sets the foundation for stuff in the Enlightenment and for ideas that are going to be fostered in the United States. First and foremost, in 1215, you have the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta basically deals with the King of England needed money to fight the French, and the nobles at the time would provide money or soldiers or whatever to fight the French. And the king had made this war with France go on too long, and he returned from France, and he was met by his nobles at Runnymede, is the name of the place, and he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, basically saying, you can't fight these endless wars without our approval, right? And it was the first document in the history of mankind that limited the powers of the king. Secondly, you have what they refer to as common law. And common law, after the Norman invaders and William the Conqueror, settles England. What he did was he divided them up into counties or reeves, or shires. Divided them up into shires, which were like counties. And each county had a shire reeve, which is where we get the term sheriff. And the sheriff would go around enacting common law. Common law is this idea that everybody was held to the same standard. All right, rich, poor, whatever. The English enterprise system, yet again, foundations for American capitalism and whatnot. Personal initiative. The idea that a person seeking out to make their own fortune was well accepted in England. Not really, peasants didn't rise up and become rich, but the middling sort did from time to time. And as we talk about the English Revolution, I'll actually bring up kind of how this new nobility caused some of that stuff. The free enterprise system, yet again, the idea that you or with your own initiative are allowed to go out and do whatever it is you want to make money. Okay, and it's sort of backed by the government. It'll let you do whatever it is. They're not going to interfere. A joint stock company, right? Joint stock companies didn't really originate in England, even though they get a lot of pub for it. The picture down here in the bottom right is actually from a Swedish joint stock company, I believe. The idea of a joint stock company and the concept of stock, where it came from, was if we're going to send a ship to sail across the ocean to go get spices or goods or trade or whatever it is, We're afraid that it might get hijacked by pirates or washed away in a shipwreck or whatever. So I don't want to spend my $100,000 or British pound sterling on that. I would rather spend, $10,000 and find 10 guys that also want to spend $10,000. That way, if something bad happens to the ship, we only lose $10,000, right? Now, at the same time, you share the profits. That's kind of the way that works, and everybody has an equal vote, right? You can see from the seals down here on this, that would have represented each guy's part or vote, or however you want to look at it. Interestingly enough, Lloyd's of London, the famous insurance company, started in this same time period and manner. Lloyd's of London started as a pub/coffee house kind of thing, and it was by the docks, and people would come in to talk about shipping, and eventually over time they began to insure the shipments. That was what ended up happening. Now, one of the things that also happened in this time period were government-sanctioned monopolies. So think the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, that sort of thing. They would receive royal charters, which would mean they were the only ones that could trade, or sometimes it would mean they didn't have to pay taxes, which alienated people. Okay, keep that in mind. That was one other thing. So they had this big free enterprise system going on, but then at the same time they had these government monopolies that undermined it at times. Also, you had the end of feudalism coming through this time period. So think of, I'm a feudal lord and I have my peasants and they work on the land, and I have to take care of them and they provide me with stuff. Maybe I send them to fight wars every now and then, that kind of thing. Well, what happened is I began to realize, or maybe if I was a new noble, I began to realize there were better ways to make money. All right, and so the enclosure movement comes around. The enclosure movement was I began to kick my peasants off the land because I didn't want to have to take care of them, and I began to fence my land in because I realized agriculture wasn't very cost effective or efficient, and I began to grow sheep. I could sell their wool. I didn't, it took a guy and maybe a sheepdog to kind of take care of them. It was a lot easier for me and a lot more profitable. Also during this time period, you begin to see a rise in crime due to the growth of population in urban areas. And so the New World will be an outlet for this, as we'll see how the English deal with the New World versus, say, the Spanish. The Spanish only allowed the upper class, people in good standing, Catholics, all that sort of stuff, to travel to the New World. While England, on the other hand, kind of flushed the toilet on the New World and said, here, take all of our scum, that kind of idea. Parliament and the Stewarts. We're going to talk a little bit more about the English Revolution in detail in class, but here's the quick version. James I, really, really Catholic, kind of, even though they had the Church of England kind of thing. Charles I, Protestant, but married to a Catholic woman, so everybody's kind of afraid of this religious aspect. They believed in the divine right of kings, that they were like demigods controlling the world kind of idea. Charles and James had begun this amount of alienating, not just the upper class and not just the lower class, but the other stuff we were just kind of mentioning kind of comes together to be a problem. So Charles I is going to be basically kicked out by the Parliament. This starts a war. Oliver Cromwell comes in. Eventually, the Puritans and Cromwell establish control of England. About 10 years later, he dies. That falls apart. They want their king back. They reinstate Charles the First's son, Charles II, and Charles II is a good old time. And eventually he dies. Now James II comes in yet again and starts to do the stuff that because Charles didn't have any kids. Charles II did. So James II, his brother, comes in, starts to be more like his father, worries the nobility in the Parliament, who had now have gained more power thanks to the Civil War. They oust James II and ask his sister, Mary, to come back and be the queen. This is referred to as the Glorious Revolution because William and Mary now, come back and retake the throne. They call it a bloodless revolution, but it really wasn't the case. Charles II actually did fight some wars, or battles in Ireland, but it wasn't in England, so I guess it doesn't really count too much for American history sometimes. Act of Toleration, Act of Settlement, Act of Union, we'll get to those in class. Oh, I could have swore I put a picture in there. Oh, well. So, settling the Chesapeake, 1606, James the First, all right? They establish the Virginia Company, okay? This is a joint stock company, much like we just talked about. James wants to send settlers to Virginia to spread Christianity to the unknowing natives kind of idea, and also they wanted to make a profit. They wanted to make England more self-sustainable. They didn't want to make them continue to rely on trade with other nations that had a better sort of geographical location for growing stuff. So they needed, the sort of Mediterranean goods like olive oil and that sort of stuff, and then forested goods like, say, pitch tar and stuff like that. They're going to do this different from the Spanish, like I've already said. They're going to not try to control the Indians as much as fight the Indians. Also, they go to set up plantations. Their idea was they were going to make these large farms and grow stuff. Now, Virginia is going to be named after Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. When the settlers for Jamestown arrive, there were something like 140 on the boat, and only 105 made it. 30 of them died on transit. They eventually pick a river that had a northwestern bend, as you'll read, because they thought they might make a passage to Asia one day, and so it would be a good thoroughfare to be on. It was located on this river they named the James, They were worried about the Spanish, so they settled far inland. They settled in a low area because they thought they could defend it for some reason, but it ended up being swampy and not so sanitary. They were ill-prepared. All right, they tended to be either run-of-the-mill people or gentleman adventurers. Your gentleman adventurer is the way of saying, like, I'm well-to-do, and I'm thinking I'm going to come find some sort of great thing, but I don't really want to work for it. And what they find is a wilderness that they're not prepared for. And they find a Indian tribe of about 10,000 in the area, led by Chief Powhatan, or Powhatan, however you want to say it. And it was a good thing that they had Captain John Smith, who was about 27 at the time. Your textbook refers to him as short and stocky, and a soldier of fortune, or whatever. He'd been a mercenary who had actually been a slave after fighting and all this sort of stuff back in Eastern Europe and stuff like that. But luckily they had him, and he institutes a sort of military regime in Virginia. All right. As it says right there, 105 settlers, only 38 survived the first months. It was a very tough living. They had to work for everything, all right? Eventually in 1609, after Smith had left, Thomas Gates comes in, all right? And Gates institutes that everyone will go to church daily, and if not, they will be flogged or put in the stocks. So, as it says in the notes there, his quote was, "God will be daily and dutifully served." The idea of worshiping God and seeking his fortune was pretty prevalent amongst the Jamestown settlers. Now, as you'll notice, we didn't talk a ton about John Smith. All right, John Smith, as we'll see, does not play too much into the Pocahontas story, but John Smith is going to be captured by Chief Powhatan. And Pocahontas does plead for his life. That is about as far as we get in the classical Disney story of Captain John Smith. More of the story with Pocahontas deals with John Rolfe. All right, and you can see this under the tobacco thing. So tobacco, and you can see it in the picture right here, was introduced by Native Americans in 1612. In 1616, Rolfe smuggles a Spanish tobacco plant very secretively across the ocean to Virginia. All right, Spain had tried to keep all the stuff from the New World secret so they could continue to profit from it. So this was actually kind of a daring move. And he plants tobacco in Virginia. And the world was changed ever since from that. Now, Rolfe is going to marry Pocahontas. Now, I don't know if this, I imagine this happens after the fact that somebody actually kidnaps her and tries to blackmail the chief into return her, but eventually Rolfe marries her. They then set off for England, and she becomes a little bit of a sideshow kind of spectacle in England, but even though she dies like 2 or 3 years later in England at the age of 20. So, the story of Pocahontas does not end as a happy one. Now, to get more people over there, since people had been dying left and right, in 1618, Sir Edwin Sandys institutes the headright system. And the idea was if you came from the New World, you would get 50 acres of land, and 50 acres for any servants that you brought. So it was trying to entice upper class guys to come settle in Virginia, because if you had a lot of servants, you could have a lot of land. Also, during this time period, they're going to end their sort of military, martial law kind of thing that they have going on, because they're starting to turn a profit. So in 1619, the Virginia Assembly meets for the first time, right, instituting self-government in the United States. Also in 1619, an important thing happens. The first ship carrying women and the first shipment of African slaves to Jamestown occurs. 1622, the Indians get pretty upset, and we start to see the conflict between the natives and the colonists come to a head, right? The natives had fields and lands that they had, traditionally owned or cultivated, and now American farmers were looking to take those lands. So, 1622, Powhatan kills a fourth of all the settlers in Jamestown and surrounding areas. All right, and this basically puts the Indians squarely in the crosshairs of the colonists. So the Algonquins in 1607 had something like 24,000. By 1669, they only had 2,000. All right, eventually over this time period, more than that over that 60-year time period. But what's going to start to happen is it was so difficult to live in Virginia that over this time period, we'll just say that 14,000 settlers migrated to Virginia. Of that thing, at the same time, there were only 1,100 people. So it was very, very difficult and hard living in Virginia. You had Indian fighting, you had to worry about death and disease. Your textbook will talk about the starving time right after the time that Virginia was assembled, or Jamestown was assembled. So it was a very, very difficult place to live. Now, the Virginia Company becomes abolished, right? Which means they weren't making enough money. And usually, just to be honest, that's how these early joint stock companies worked. They weren't like corporations today that were in, indeterminable length that would just go on and on and on. Virginia companies stock companies usually got together for a purpose, like a sea voyage for establishing a colony, I guess, and then they would break the profits up and everybody would go on their way. That's actually one of the big questions people have about corporations. And it becomes a royal colony. Okay, so remember, and we'll talk about this more, but there were 3 types of colonies. You had royal colonies, you had proprietary colonies, and charter colonies, right? And we'll look at these in class. As the tobacco prices rise, people wanted to go to the colony. So by 1650, you had 15,000 people in Virginia. Clearly, this doesn't match up with my dates of earlier, but yet again, I'll look at it. More large and large planters. Okay, this is yet again the first time we'll see this term. Planters are large landowners that wanted to have big farms. They began to consolidate their land and their labor. They wanted to have more. They wanted to have a working class, and they wanted to have a large amount of land to work. Well, when it says consolidate, what it means is you had all these unindentured servants. Okay, an indentured servant, as we'll talk about, will come from Europe, usually brought over by somebody to work, who will pay his way. So say it's $5,000 to travel from Europe to America. They will pay their way, and then they will have to work the $5,000 off roughly. And the system is that once you worked off that land, you received your freedom dues, or what it was called. I'll have to look it up. I'm sure it's in another chapter. And the freedom dues were basically you received a set of tools and land and stuff to work on your own. Well, what happened is so many of these guys came over to work and there wasn't enough work, or they would get out of their indentured contracts too soon, that there was this massive amount of people that were just sort of roaming the countryside causing problems. So the landowning class, the planters, had a lot of sway and controlled the House of Burgesses, the Virginia Parliament, and they made the laws stricter that made the indentured contracts longer. So that would clean a lot of that up, and it would mean they'd have more guys to work their fields. This is going to make everyone unhappy. Okay? So, well, when we get to Bacon's Rebellion, William Berkeley is the governor of Virginia, and he referred to the mass of people as poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. All right? And Nathaniel Bacon sometimes gets lauded as this, freedom fighter kind of thing. But in actuality, he was a kind of pretentious rich guy that was kind of looking for problems. And he had this sort of crazy hate for Native Americans, and he wanted to kill all the Native Americans. And so what he does is he goes to attack the Native Americans. William Berkeley won't let him attack the Native Americans because effectively it would screw up his trade. And so, his trade of deerskins and stuff like that with the Native Americans. So Bacon goes on the offensive and burns Jamestown. Now this will, be a short-lived victory for him because he'll die within I think a few months later of some infection or something like that. Berkeley rounds up all the people with him and hangs them. The king gets word of it, doesn't like how Berkeley acted. He recalls him to England, where he dies also within the year. But out of this, what happens is we get relaxed laws about indentured servitude, and more land open up to more people. And this, I guess, is the end of the end of part 1 of chapter 2.